Hello, everybody, and welcome to How to Read the Bible. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about Genesis chapters 37 through 50. We've been talking about Genesis for a while. If you haven't seen those videos, go back and watch them. I hope that this continues to encourage you to read the scriptures for themselves. But as we engage the scriptures together, we're going to do a small overview today of chapters 37 through 50 and ask the questions: what does this scripture say? What in the world is going on in this scripture? And what is God up to? Who is God? And what is God doing as we read these chapters? So let's just jump into it. Let me share this presentation with you. Genesis 37 through 50 is connected to chapters 12 through 50. It is the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's family. But 37 through 50 takes kind of a different tone, a different way of storytelling. It reads more like a short story than a kind of family novel as we've been reading in Genesis. So 37 through 50 really focuses on the story of Joseph, one of Jacob's sons. If you remember from last video, Jacob's name has been changed to Israel. That's why we have the Israelites, because it is the family of Israel, who was Jacob. And here is where we really find out how the Israelites got into Egypt in the first place. Many of us might know the story of the Exodus, the next book in the Bible, of how Moses freed the Israelites from the Egyptians, how God sent Moses and liberated them from their slavery in Egypt. But how did they get there? Were they immediately in slavery? What caused them to go to Egypt in the first place and take up residence there? Did the Egyptians take them there? What happened? Well, these are the chapters that really talk about that answer those questions. But first, let me talk a little bit about the cultural and historical background. Um, the opening of chapter 37 really sets the stage for what this story is about. It's about Jacob and his family's residence now in Canaan, um, a, a land that is new to them with many different people groups living there. As we talked about last week, it's part of the Fertile Crescent. This in the picture that's here on the slide, that green area that reaches from Mesopotamia all the way down to Egypt and down the Nile was called the Fertile Crescent because it was fertile. It was fertile for growing crops. It was fertile because of the water and the rivers there. It was fertile because civilization could grow there. And along those trade routes that ultimately formed because of how fertile and how prosperous this area was, all of these trade routes lead toward Egypt. Egypt is the main superpower, and there's maybe other uprising nations out of Mesopotamia that try to take over land and build their empires, but they're all trying to get to Egypt. Likewise, just regular people are um, feeding off of and being sustained and trading with this Egyptian led economy. Um, that's not to say that that's a great thing. Um, the Egyptians were not incredibly um, courteous to just anyone, but they were the superpower at the time. They were the richest nation, and we will see how that works out in the rest of the story of Joseph. But we want to focus on that little circle in the map. That's where Canaan is. That's the general area where Canaan is. And that's going to be a very important area of geography for us as we move forward in the story of the Bible, because that's eventually what becomes Israel as a nation, as a people. As are led out of Egypt, that's where they go. They take up residence again in Canaan. Um, But let's focus on this story. You might know some of the Joseph story. And I think most people, if they know about the Joseph story, they know about his coat. They know about Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat, the musical. They know about the coat of many colors from maybe the Dolly Parton song, or from just knowing about this Bible story. And the phrase for Joseph's coat is kind of interesting. It's not really known what it exactly means. It's a strange word in Hebrew, a strange phrase, because as you can imagine, the Bible doesn't talk a lot about coats. And so when it talks about this coat, it's kind of a unique occurrence. Um, so because it's hard to translate, it often gets translated in different ways. One of those ways is a coat of many colors. It's a colorful coat. However, it can also be interpreted as a kind of dress coat, a shirt with long sleeves. Um, Either way, it really depicts Jacob's favoritism toward his son Joseph. Because if you can imagine this, Jacob has 12 sons who do work for him. If you have kids, you probably have kids do chores around the house. Especially if you've worked in kind of agriculture, um, shepherding, farming things, you get your kids to work when they're able to because you need help. So imagine all of Jacob's sons working. What kind of things were they wearing when they worked? Probably not something with long sleeves, because with things with long sleeves, they get dirty, they get smudged up. You'd have to roll them up to even get to work. Uh, Even if this is a colorful coat, you can imagine you don't want to get that coat dirty working. So here you have Joseph, the favorite son of Jacob, wearing this coat because he probably doesn't have to work all that much. He's probably catered to and coddled a little by his father because he's his father's favorite. And that makes his brothers jealous. We also might remember that's how Jacob was treated by his father, or by his mother. He was the favorite of his mother. He was in the house most of the time. So he gives his son, his favorite son, a coat that he doesn't have to work in. He just gets to wear it. And it's just a signal to his whole family. This is the favorite son. And in a culture where most often the oldest son is favored, right? The oldest son gets the inheritance. The oldest son carries on the family name first, is the first probably to get married, and gets the greatest share of the family wealth. Joseph doesn't favor his oldest son like Isaac did. He favors his youngest and second youngest. Benjamin will be born after Joseph, but he favors his youngest at the time. Why? Because he was the youngest. Why? Because he was his mother's favorite son. Why? Because Joseph is the only son of Rachel. If you remember, Jacob has two wives. He has Rachel and Leah. And Leah he doesn't love, but Rachel he does. Um, and so Rachel finally has a son that God gives her, and so Jacob favors this son. You can see where this family, the cultural aspects of how this family's dysfunction get put on display could lead to some tension, and we're going to get into that tension in a moment. But first, I want to mention a couple of things that are happening in the world. During this story, a famine breaks out, a large famine, a widespread famine in this Fertile Crescent. And people have to seek food. They have to go to where food is. So while Joseph is in Egypt, a famine hits, and we'll get into to how, but Egypt has a large store of grain. And so people from surrounding countries go to Egypt to try to get grain for their lives to sustain them. Uh, Life is built around water in this world. And when is no water and when there is no rain, it's still hot. And there's not a place that they can go around in the desert to find food. So they got to go elsewhere where there is grain. And a lot of emphasis will be put on, or a lot of talk will be on the Pharaoh in this story. Joseph will encounter the Pharaoh of Egypt, the most powerful man in this entire world at the time, but we never learn his name. And I think that's significant in and of itself. And we'll talk a little more about that when we get to Exodus next week. But in the story of the Bible, none of the pharaohs are ever named. We never know who the pharaohs are because the Bible never really even mentions who they are or what their name is. Surely the people at the time would have known who they were, but we don't out of the Bible because the Bible is focusing on the names of these faithful folks, these folks that are of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's family, not these seemingly powerful uh, emperors, but these lowly farmers who are faithful to the Lord. But that being said, it's thought that this pharaoh was probably Ramses the first or the second, um, because there were three Ramses in Egypt, a dynasty around the time that we think that this happened. And at the beginning of Exodus, the current Pharaoh that knows Joseph dies. So we know it's got to be one of them, or it seems to be that it's one of them. But again, we don't really know. So we just have to kind of make guesses and educated guesses as to who they are because the Bible doesn't tell us, doesn't think it's important to name this Pharaoh. But the Bible, it does think it's important for us to know the names of Jacob and his sons. So let's get into that. This is a story about famine, family, and forgiveness. In the beginning of this story, Joseph's brothers betray him and lie to their father. Again, the kid with the long sleeves that doesn't have to work, that uh, is favored by his father, he has a dream where he is over and above his brothers. And that's just the last straw. The brothers make a plan, a very well executed, conniving plan, much like their father might have come up with, to get rid of Joseph. And so, out of their jealousy, they trap Joseph in a pit, but they come up with a further plan to sell him to the Midianites. They sell him off so that he can be rid of, or they can be rid of him, and have him out of their lives. So they sell him to the Midianites, who then sell Joseph to a man named Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. And we'll pick up with Joseph in a minute, but the story doesn't just leave the brothers alone and go to Joseph. They tell us that that the brothers actually stole Joseph's coat, his long sleeve, maybe many colored coat, and covered it with blood from probably a lamb, one of their herd, and brought it to their father and said, "Look what happened to your son. Wolves must have gotten him. Something attacked him." And his father Jacob is just distraught. But the wool is over his eyes. The Joseph's brothers have convinced Jacob that this has been done. Much like Jacob convinced his father that he was Esau, his sons convinced him that they were innocent, but somebody killed Joseph. But Joseph is still alive. Before we get to Joseph, I want to just make a quick mention of Genesis 38. It's a little bit of it feels really just like an interruption to the story, but it is an important story to hear. I'll just quickly recap it because it does, we don't have enough time to get too into it. But Judah, one of Jacob's sons, has a daughter-in-law who becomes a widow, and Tamar is her name. She dresses up like a prostitute, and Judah mistakenly sleeps with her, and they have a child together. And Judah has been tricked um, and kind of just concedes to say, you fooled me twice, shame on me. And it's not really a story that it doesn't have a hero. Let me just say that it's not a story that we draw like a, oh, Tamar was really right in the right, or Judah was in the right. They were both in their ways in the wrong. Um, but what is important for us as Christians to in the story, as well as just readers of the Bible, is to see that Judah's unfaithfulness is there from the beginning, and Judah will become Judea. Judah will become the line of kings. Judah is um, very important to the story, uh, but we also know that God can bring redemption out of even the unfaithfulness of God's people, because it is out of um, these children, these twins that are born out of this weird story, that we get the line that Jesus is born into. How wild is that? Just a little tidbit of information for how God can bring good out of a dysfunctional family, and that is a long form description of what this story really gets at, because Joseph tells us a story about how God can bring good out of a bad situation. Joseph, we'll pick up with Joseph again. Joseph goes into slavery in Egypt, and he is in Potiphar's house. He's his servant, but Potiphar's wife takes fancy to him and tries to sleep with him. And Joseph resists the advances of Potiphar's wife, but Potiphar doesn't believe him, so he has him arrested. He has him put in jail. While he's in jail, he does what we read in the beginning of his story. He starts interpreting dreams for good result and bad result for his fellow prisoners. And this practice of interpreting dreams eventually gets Joseph an audience with Pharaoh, because Pharaoh has this dream that he can't understand, and he wants his other officials to interpret it for him, but they can't. So one of Joseph's fellow prisoners at the time, who eventually gets back into work with the Pharaoh, tells the Pharaoh about this Joseph guy who can interpret dreams. So Pharaoh goes and gets him, and he interprets the dream, and it turns out that the dream is about a famine that will happen for the whole world in that area of the earth. So for their whole world, people are going to need some food. So Pharaoh really does put the trust into Joseph's hands and puts him in charge of gathering grain for the safety of the people, for the preservation of life and what is going to happen. And it comes to pass. And because of Joseph and this interpretation of a dream, they gather up stores of grain, and all the people come to Egypt to try to get some food. And that's where we pick up again with Joseph's family, with Jacob and his sons. Now Jacob is very old, and Jacob's son, his youngest son Benjamin, is born, but Joseph's never really uh, hasn't seen him, doesn't know him, and Joseph's family comes into Egypt. Jacob's sons are sent on a mission to come and get grain. And they see Joseph, but they don't recognize him. Obviously, they sold him in slavery a long time ago. They don't recognize him as this Egyptian official now. So Joseph really doesn't tell them who he is at first, but sends them back and forth to verify their trustworthiness, to verify that his father and his younger brother is still alive, and has them even bring him uh, to meet Joseph. And Joseph eventually is cut to the heart. He is overwhelmed by this situation and reveals who he is to his brothers, who are just floored. They are floored by the fact that their brother that they tried to kill is now in charge of their life. They can get grain or they can't from their brother that they threw in a pit and sold into slavery. Um, but Joseph forgives them. He he says something very profound. He says, "What you intended for evil, God intended for good. It's brought good out of and has preserved life." And that's the Joseph story. He goes on to tell about how Joseph's family then comes and moves to Egypt to be with him, and they take up residence, I believe in Goshen. That's don't quote me on that. I think I need to verify that, but I think it's a place called Goshen, and they take up residence there, and that's how the people of Israel, how Jacob's family come to be in Egypt, not because of the Egyptians, but because of them. Now, how they get into slavery is another story. But for this story, it's about famine and family and ultimately forgiveness. But God is still at work. You might have noticed that I didn't mention God a whole lot in that story. That's because God's role is not as explicitly named in the text of 37 through 50 in Genesis. It is explicitly named what you intended for evil, God intended for good, that God was with Joseph, that God was there. But we never hear God talking to Joseph. We never hear God explicitly talked about as much as we do in, my goodness, in the rest of Genesis, where God is in, every story, every other verse. God created and God spoke and God said to Abraham, and God worked this in Jacob. And you know the explicitness of God's involvement is very much differently told. It's not as explicitly stated, but God is still at work. So it kind of tells us that even in those stories where God doesn't seem to be active, God is still there. For example, the book of Esther never mentions Yahweh's name, but God is still at work. God still brings salvation to the Jews in that story, and the same with Joseph. Joseph is a short story told from the position of exile, much like Esther, much like portions of Daniel. And um, it doesn't have a lot of just this bombastic statement about God involved in the story. It just tells you the story, and you kind of come to the conclusion that God has been involved this whole time through Joseph's confession. You read the whole story back and you say, wow, God intended this for good. How? How wonderful and how tragic that this had to happen that this didn't have to happen, obviously, that this happened to Joseph. But wow, that God can bring good out of even that dysfunctional of a family. And so that brings the next theological statement. Even though you intended harm, God intended good in order to preserve life. Joseph's story, much like several stories in the Bible, many stories in the Bible, deal with the issue of bad things happening to faithful people. You think about Job and how his family was taken away. Another story for another day, but Joseph is a faithful person. Though his father treats him with favor, he is faithful. He loves his brothers. He doesn't do anything wrong, yet his brothers betray him and the brothers throw him in a pit. He's just interpreting dreams. His brothers take it as a threat to their power, so they kill him. They try to kill him. But still, bad things happen to Joseph. He's thrown into prison. He gets he's traumatized. This is a hard life for Joseph here. But God still is involved in his story. God didn't cause the harm. God did bring good out of it. God brings good to Joseph even in the midst of the betrayal of those closest to him. And Joseph, in turn, is faithful to his family, even though they weren't faithful to him. Recognizes God's work in this situation, and a tragedy that didn't stop him from being faithful, but has actually ultimately brought life to more people than what what Jacob's sons could have ever imagined when they threw Joseph in a pit. So lastly, that brings us to the ultimate glimpse into God's involvement here. God provides blessings to the nations, namely Egypt and the other nations who come to Egypt, through Abraham's descendants, namely Joseph. If you remember, God promises Abraham a son and says, you will have many descendants, and your descendants, through your descendants, all the nations will be blessed. And we're told that the whole world came to Joseph to buy grain. God answers God's promises yet again. Even when the people that God promised these things to tried to take life away, God brings life to the nations. I hope that that's helpful for you. This is one of my favorite stories in the scriptures, and I hope that that helps to wrap up this book, the book of Genesis, and maybe you can read it again, knowing that this is where it is headed. But we're going to move forward into the book of Exodus, and again, we're kind of picking up the pace here. So continue reading the scriptures, continue diving into these videos. I hope that you're blessed. Have a safe day. We love you. Goodbye.